Provide a little backdrop for those both old and new to PON. As many of you will know, the program on negotiation is the world's leading research center for over 40 years now on topics related to negotiation, mediation, and conflict resolution. And one of the many avenues that we pursue in support of research in this field is actually bringing on and supporting the next generation of scholars in our chosen topics. And we have a variety of grants and fellowships that are available every year, but the really crowning fellowship every year is our Graduate Research Fellowship, which is an annual fellowship where we award a year of study to several promising doctoral students to come and spend the year with us in Cambridge, Massachusetts, to study alongside our faculty, to participate in our courses and the lives of our center. And it is always such a pleasure to have them join us each fall. And it is with great sadness each spring that we watch them, go on to great new things, finishing their theses and going on to the rest of their lives after PON. And we're always so delighted when they stay in touch. We have many former graduate research fellows who have gone on to illustrious careers in a variety of fields, and even some who have stayed here at Harvard and become faculty here. So it is a great pleasure, but with a hint of sadness and loss as we watch our fellows graduate, that we invite them each spring to present the work that they have been doing, both in the course of their PhDs writ large, but also during specifically the time of their year at the program on negotiation. And they are supported by the entire PON community, from our faculty members, our executive committee members, to the staff. I would like to thank, first and foremost, our committee of fellowship reviewers who every year help to pick the outstanding fellows who join us. It is a very wonderful thing to be involved in that process, also very labor intensive as we receive so many applications. And then on the PON staff side, we have an entire team that supports their work. I would like to especially thank Laura San Pietro, our Associate Director for Research and Pedagogy, who did so much work welcoming the fellows and stewarding them throughout their time here. And then, of course, CJ Bigsby, our event and outreach coordinator, and Luis Reyes, who is supporting this event today. So thanks to all of them. And this year, our three fellows came from three different corners of the globe. So Charlotte Hamm is a PhD candidate in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and a research associate at the Berghof Foundation. She is joined by Yaoxi Shi, who is a PhD candidate in organizational behavior at Imperial College London. So you will be hearing from these three esteemed scholars over the course of this next hour and a half. And I will note that we have a little bit of extended time to give each of our fellows time to present. The fellows will be invited on one by one. Each will give about a 20-minute presentation on their chosen topic, and then we will invite about 10 minutes of Q&A from the audience for each one. So we will, the first fellow will present, and we will have Q&A on her part, and then the second one will come on, and so on. If you have to leave at any point and can't stay for the entirety of the event, I will note that this session is being recorded and it will be posted on our website in about a week. Or if you would like to invite someone else to view it or anything else, please do, of course, feel free to access that recording. All right, without further ado, first up alphabetically is our wonderful fellow Charlotte. We have so enjoyed getting to know her over the course of the year. And Charlotte, we look forward to hearing about your research. I am going to turn over the Zoom floor to you now.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for the kind introduction. And thank you also for this incredible opportunity to get to be a fellow here at PON. I will share my screen now. So I will be talking about rehumanizing the enemy during peace negotiations. Before I started this research project, I was working on support to the Afghan peace process and the intra-Afghan peace negotiations that were taking place in Doha, Qatar. And as most of you will remember, these negotiations really came to a horrible and horrific ending. And there are many reasons why the negotiation failed. But when I reflected back at the negotiations after some time, I also realized that every now and then there were moments where something between the negotiators was changing. Some of the dynamics somehow shifted. There could have been a moment of shared laughter or a moment of shared suffering. Some of the negotiators actually even celebrated Ramadan together. So I wanted to understand, what was it that I had observed here? What was this change in dynamic between the enemies in the room? And I'm sure that everyone who's working on bringing together conflict actors, either in war zones or in divided society, has observed these moments where something is changing between the actors in the room. So I started my research by traveling to former conflict zones. I went to Northern Ireland and to Colombia, and I interviewed peace negotiators, and I asked them, for you, what was a psychological turning point? What was a moment where you felt like there is no going back to before? And what they described over and over again was when they started to see the human side of the other. So, for example, when they saw the head of the guerrilla on the phone with their daughter, or when they saw the military chief really nervous about to give a presentation, or when they saw a member from the rebel group falling ill in need of medical care. So this is what I in this thesis call rehumanization. And when I then turned my attention to the literature to read about rehumanization, I realized there's really not a lot out there, not on the theory of rehumanization or the concept of rehumanization or factors that facilitate rehumanization. And that is why the main question of my PhD, what the thesis is dedicated to, is what is rehumanization and how does it unfold? So while there is not a lot on rehumanization, there really is a lot on dehumanization. So I'm trying to understand how to move away from dehumanization towards rehumanization. And dehumanization is a psychological mechanism that unfolds during violent conflict. And here I'm using a quote from an interview I conducted, and the interviewee was describing dehumanization as often the enemy was faceless, someone without a shape, just a uniform with a weapon. To me, they were an instrument of war, death, and violence that could either kill me and my community or be defeated by us. In war, you cannot see the enemy's heart. And then later, towards the negotiations or towards the end of the negotiation, quotes sounded more like this. Often during violent conflict, a myth of who the enemy is constructed. The myth evolves as knowledge of the other evolves. The perception of the enemy changed when I was at the negotiation table. You sit close to them and you realize how similar they are to you. Then you realize that the enemy was an imaginary enemy, a myth. So this PhD is trying to understand the movement away from dehumanization on this continuum. What facilitates this change? How do we rehumanize? And how can we create and design environments, rooms, activities that allow for this progress? So why does it matter? I already mentioned the wealth of literature out there on dehumanization that has been crucial to understand genocide, war atrocities, polarization, and also racism and sexism. And rehumanization holds equally valuable but largely untapped potential. Also, it is very timely significant because we find ourselves increasingly in polarized and divided societies. So this PhD is situated at the nexus of social psychology and conflict studies and advances both the literature on dehumanization and on rehumanization. When the research design I used for the study was a qualitative case study of the Havana peace negotiations, which took place between the government in Colombia and the FARC, the biggest Marxist guerrilla in Colombia. I conducted interviews and then did a thematic analysis to identify patterns. And I also made use of quantitative measures because there are in psychology some scales that help you measure dehumanization. The conflict I looked at is the conflict in Colombia that was over 50 years long. That was a conflict between the Colombian government and different rebel groups. The biggest one was the FARC. And the war led to roughly 450,000 deaths and 8 million people were displaced. So there was really, over an extended period of time, deeply entrenched dehumanization going on. So in the interviews, when I analyzed them, I saw that there's this emotional component to dehumanization. For example, some of the interviews would say, my feeling before the negotiation was, and the word is hard, but it can't be less, hatred. It was disgust, these monsters, I despise them. Or you only see fear and danger, not if there is a woman or a child. You attack the enemy, not as a political enemy, but as an animal. On the cognitive level, they would say something like, to them, we were a symbol of 200 years of oppression. There was no nuance, a system of the elite, the oligarchs. And on the behavior level, the enemy needed to be vanquished, liquidated as fast as possible without stopping to even think about it. So this illustrates that dehumanization is a psychological mechanism that unfolds on the emotional, cognitive, and behavior level. So emotionally, you can have strong emotions such as disgust and hate. On a cognitive level, you have black and white thinking that removes all nuance, and then you act on that through violent and aggressive behavior. However, as indicated by these dots here, you can have these strong feelings of disgust and hate, or, for example, you can have feelings of racism. You can have, on the cognitive level, dehumanizing thoughts or belief, for example, in white supremacy. Whether or not that is translated into behavior depends on social norms, depends on incentive structures. So you can have these beliefs, but not act on them because you worry that you would get punished or you worried that you would face negative reactions. But if you are in an environment that encourages this behavior, you are more likely to act on these emotions and cognition and to actually translate that also into your behavior. So the first half of the dehumanization, rehumanization continuum, what I did here is that I took the wealth of literature that is out there on dehumanization and I organized it on a continuum. And this is relevant because how rehumanization looks will depend on where on that spectrum you are, whether it's just a subtle form or a very extreme form of dehumanization. So dehumanization starts with indifference. Indifference is a subtle and socially normalized form of dehumanization. It means that there is a minimal recognition of the other as a human, but they're seen as distant and as abstract, and there's reduced empathy. We have that, for example, when we walk past homeless people, when we watch disturbing news, or a surgeon might do that when they operate on their patient. So the important psychological function here is emotional regulation to avoid emotional overload and to avoid emotional burnout. That then moves to the more extreme form of infrahumanization, where the other is seen as human, but less of a human than you or your in-group. So they are lacking human essence, they're lacking complex emotions. And we see that, for example, in sexism, we see it in racism. And on a moral level, that helps justify the status quo, it helps justify systemic oppression and social hierarchies. That then can move to dehumanization, and we saw the quotes from dehumanization before. Dehumanization means that the identity of the other is removed, that they have a community and families removed from them, and they are morally excluded. So standards of fairness and equality no longer apply to them. And there's also denial of nuance and complexity. And this helps remove feelings of guilt, feelings of remorse, and we see this in warfare, and we see it in violent conflict. The most extreme form is demonization. Demonization means that the other is seen as demonic, they're seen as evil, they're seen as subhuman, and as an existential threat. And that now renders violence not just permissible, but necessary. The moral evil must be eliminated. We see that in genocidal violence and in mass killings. This is, for example, when the Nazis said, oh, we have to free the world of the Jewish virus. So it's important to keep in mind here that there is a strategic use of dehumanization. There's a lot of money, a lot of resources invested into dehumanization. Media plays a key role, and this aims at maintaining the status quo, justifying violence, and also keeping and maintaining support for warfare. And the quotes so far looked at the more extreme forms of demonization and dehumanization, thinking that what applies to these extreme forms is likely also going to apply to the lesser extreme forms. So what I wanted to understand is how to undo dehumanization. How do we rehumanize each other again? And this is now also mainly the main contribution of my PhD. It is very rare for actors that dehumanize each other to come together, to spend time together. One of the very rare occasions where that actually happens are peace negotiations. So I am studying peace negotiation as a microcosm where enemies that are fighting each other come together. And the peace negotiations I looked at, the Havana peace negotiations, are known to be the most comprehensive peace negotiations of the recent history, meaning that actors who were fighting each other now all of a sudden lived together in Havana for 4 years. There was back-channel communication, there were subcommissions, there were working groups, there were the official negotiations. There were all these little interactions and interventions taking place that facilitate progress towards rehumanization. And there was one key rule during this negotiation that was, we will negotiate as if there was no war, and we will fight war as if there were no negotiations. Meaning that the negotiations in Havana were kind of isolated from the country where the war was still ongoing. And here too, rehumanization unfolding on the emotional level. One of the quotes said, so he would stand up very, very nervous, sweating and all, when he was about to give a presentation. Seeing this guy, who was the symbol of awful things, so weak and nervous, it made me think, oh, there's a human being behind this awful thing. On the cognitive level, we didn't become friends, not at all, but I started to see that they were human beings. And on the behavior level, we all like arepas. So we decided to create recipes together to cook Colombian dishes in Havana. Those little daily things started to change things in a positive way. So showing that rehumanization also unfolds on the emotional, cognitive, and behavior level. So maybe now you have less of a physical reaction of disgust when you see the other. And maybe you are thinking less in black and white, good and evil, and you see they actually have a complex history, they had a complex life. Whether or not, again, as indicated by these dots here, that is translated into behavior depends on social norms, depends on incentives. For example, the negotiators were saying we couldn't tell our friends and family back in Colombia that we were now eating lunch with the FARC or that we were going on walks with the FARC because there's a fear of social sanctions, there's a fear of exclusion and of moral condemnations. So even if your emotion and your cognition of dehumanization change towards rehumanization, whether or not you act on that depends on social norms and incentive structures. So another thing that's important here is that this is a very psychologically demanding process. It is not easy to all of a sudden change how you feel, think, and act towards the other after years of conflict. So rehumanization also unfolds on a continuum, starting with partial humanization of the other, and this is undoing infrahumanization. So you give back the human essence and the complex emotions, and you start seeing the humanity of the previously dehumanized in a partial way, but not yet complete. completely happens during the rehumanization stage, where you see that they have their own identity, they have a community and friends. You see them as a nuanced person, as a complex individual, and they are rendered morally human again. So morally human does not mean that they shouldn't face punishment or they shouldn't face consequences for war crimes that were committed. It just means that the punishment or the sanctions that are inflicted should be the way you punish a human versus how you would punish an animal or treat an animal or treat a virus. And the most extreme form of rehumanization is called metahumanization. So this is where you have human interconnectedness, empathy and compassion, and even friendships developing, and the other is seen as psychologically proximate again. And not all of the negotiators made it to metahumanization, but there are definitely examples of where they moved all the way from demonizing to becoming friends and metahumanization. So as you see here, indicated by the dots that say negotiator 1, 2, 3, negotiators enter the negotiation on different stages. Some might be really hating the other, demonizing them, and some might only infrahumanize them. And that is because some of them, for example, the intelligence officers from two sides, they had spent a lot of time analyzing the other, stepping into the shoes of the other, really trying to understand where they're coming from. So they had already moved away a bit from the extreme enemy images. And then throughout the negotiations, really most of them moved towards rehumanization, some all the way and some a bit less. And a very strong nuance was introduced. So they would say, yes, I actually like the female negotiators, but the man, honestly, I think they still did evil things. Or they were saying, yes, I now see the combatants differently, but the politicians. So it meant that the enemy image was less rigid and there was more nuance and complexity introduced into that perception. Another important factor is this is not a linear process, meaning that you can progress and then stagnate and have regression. For example, sometimes there was progress during the negotiations, and then there was an attack on the ground, a family member was hit, a friend was killed, and then there was movement backwards again. So just to illustrate that this is not a process that goes straightly forward, but movement back and forth is very likely. So what are the factors that facilitate progress on the spectrum? So some of the interviewees were saying, when we talked about daily life, her military life in the armed forces and my life in the rebel group, we understood that we are similar or related to everyday activities and informality. When we shared coffee or a cigarette, we did not talk about the negotiations. We talked about the life of each other, family, music, stories, landscapes. So in line with existing literature, one of the main factors that facilitates rehumanization is contact and also imagined contact. So even before the negotiation, if you start empathizing with the other through stepping into the shoes of them or role play, that already has an effect. Shared identity. And here it was very interesting because after a while in the negotiations, they had subcommissions. And they had, for example, a subcommission on gender, where you had women from the FARC and women from the government, and they were applying a gender lens to the peace agreement. And quite quickly, the new in-group were the women, and the new out-group were the men, the patriarchy, the machismo. And there was a lot of progress in terms of working together, and there were close relationships developed in that gender commission. You also had a subcommission on ceasefire, where you had combatants from the FARC and military from the government, so actors who had actually been fighting each other on the ground. And quite quickly, they started sharing war anecdotes. They were showing each other scars they had from the war. They were bonding over fighting in rural Colombia. And the new in-group was us combatants, and the out-group were, the politicians, the corrupt politicians. So really bonding over these shared identities. Then vulnerability, which has been less talked about in the literature, had a very big impact on rehumanization. A key turning point here were the victim hearings. when you had victims and survivors from Colombia flying to Havana, and they were giving testimonies and sharing their stories. And that really led to a lot of strong emotions. Some of the FARC or government representatives even started crying, and it really gave a human face to the conflict. As a subsection of shared identity, identifying commonality, some realized that they liked the same author. There was also a moment where the Colombian soccer team was playing, and they were both watching it, not together, but they knew we're cheering for the same team. And then also informality. So little everyday activities such as going for a walk, drinking coffee, smoking a cigarette. However, and that's quite important, the timing really matters because the facilitators tried to organize informal dinners early on, and it really backfired. The negotiators were saying it's too early, we don't want to sit next to each other, we don't want to eat dinner, it feels forced. So this is why timing and sequencing of which rehumanization intervention should come when really matters. In the moment of demonization, when there are still bombs dropping left and right, you first of all have to change the war rhetoric. It's difficult to negotiate if you call the other a terrorist. And then you have to remove them from the actual threat environment, because as long as you're in that environment, empathizing or rehumanizing the other is psychologically not possible. And then you can start with contact, commonality, informality, later on shared identities such as the subcommissions, vulnerabilities such as the victim hearings. And I'm happy to talk about this and process design, how to set this up in more detail in the Q&A if there are some questions. And now, why does it matter for the peace negotiations if the actors actually rehumanize each other? So in Colombia, as I had said, you had the negotiations happen kind of separately from the conflict in the country where the war was still ongoing. And at the end of the negotiations, there was a referendum, and the people in Colombia had the chance to vote either for or against the agreement. And the majority, a small majority, but the majority actually voted against the peace agreement. And that was at a time where the FARC had left the jungle, and they were encircled by the military, and the whole country was in limbo. Are we going back to war? What is happening? And during that time, a lot of phone calls were taking place between the negotiators from the different sides. And one of the phone calls, the following was said. The moment we lost the referendum, she called me crying on the phone saying, "I don't want to go back to the jungle." I said, "I don't want to fight you again. We are friends. We know each other. We've been working together. So I'm not going to fight you anymore. What are we going to do?" I said to her, "If this goes back to where we were, I'm going to quit the military. I'm not going to fight anymore. How could I try and kill you?" That's when the whole thing was irreversible. So this shows that peace negotiations are not really about coming to an agreement. They are about implementing the agreement. And right now we're seeing a trend towards deal making, towards fast-track peace negotiations, where there's not a lot of time for interpersonal relationships to develop, for rehumanization to take place. But during the implementation phase, there are usually big stress tests. And if there's not a network, a safety net of the relationships established, there is a high chance that the agreement will fail during the implementation phase. And actually, right now, what we're seeing with a trend away from comprehensive agreements that allow for this interpersonal transformation, we see a trend away from the successful implementations of agreement. So lastly, questions for further research. So it's important to further study how can we sustain rehumanization over time? And also, how can we design interventions for norms changes via media, television, music, so that the changes also happen in society at large? And also, another relevant question is, how does this apply to asymmetrical power? For example, when you have genocidal violence, when you have a clear victim-perpetrator dynamic, and when there is no accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, for your presentation. And oh, you get to stay on because we're going to ask you questions. Don't go away just yet. And it's been so great learning from you, someone who's really been on the front lines of this work, and having you with us throughout the course of this year. So we do have a number of questions, and folks, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. We may not have a complete 10 minutes because we're a little bit behind on time, but we will ask a few and then everyone can get in contact with you if they would like to follow up. We have some questions, Charlotte, around sort of vulnerability and empathy in the process of rehumanization. So, would it be fair to say that demonstrating vulnerability or empathy helps to assist in that process? And, is this a tool that you would advocate for implementing more in to accelerate rehumanization?
Mhm. Yeah, great question. So I think here the timing is crucial. Too early on, vulnerability can, of course, also be used against you. And when there's no trust, it can be seen as manipulative or something like that. But once you have progressed a bit, once you have a working relationship established, then having moments of vulnerability that either happen naturally. For example, there was a car accident in the negotiations where the nephew of one of the negotiators was injured, and then there were condolences from the other side, and there was a real display of empathy and vulnerability. And then if you really, in terms of process design, plan for it with victim hearings and with civil society testimonies, it is a key turning point. It is one of the most powerful things that you can do if you do it at the right time, when the environment allows for that. And you can also ensure that the survivors and victims coming will be treated respectfully.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you so much. Um, Wonderful. We have a question about, I'm going to try to synthesize it. How would you characterize some aspects of dehumanization could be possibly considered as criminal because they verge on supremacy? And I know that it probably depends on the specific instance, but is this something where dehumanization itself should perhaps be demonized or even punishable under
Mhm.
certain laws? How do you view this, Charlotte?
Mhm. So I think there's also this human urge sometimes when somebody does something really horrible, such as Adolf Hitler, that we say the crimes committed now ensure that that person falls outside of the framework of humanity. We can no longer accept that that person is a human like us. And I think in very extreme cases, that makes sense. However, the risk is that you have a cycle between the dehumanized and the dehumanizer, and then you have a cycle of violence. So, in order to break that cycle of violence, it's important to move away from that dehumanization. And I would just say that it's important to really hold people accountable, to have a transitional justice mechanism where they need to give, or they're encouraged to have reparations, to have public apologies. Um, there are also examples sometimes where the perpetrators approach the victim and say, "You are the only one who can allow me to re-enter the framework of what it means to be human. So, what can I do to repair?" So this is a very interesting dynamic that is developed here. And yeah, I think definitely there's an element of dehumanization and demonization where there need to be consequences. You can't just move away from it. But that is also sometimes then for the survivors or victims to decide what they need.
Yeah, yeah, lovely. Um, you mentioned at the end of your presentation several trends that are perhaps, eh, uh, aggrandizing the amount of dehumanization that exists. Are there any specific avenues coming out of your research that would help to fast track humanization? Things that folks should be implementing during peace processes or other as ways to combat the societal trends.
Yeah, so I think in terms of in general, Rehumanization actually happens quicker than we think. And there's some fascinating neuroscience also on how when we dehumanize certain areas in the brain aren't activated and how quickly they can reactivate when we rehumanize. I think there need to be more strategy and then there need to be more financing. For example, if you scroll on your phone and the algorithm feeds you more and more extreme dehumanization, there should be a movement to counter that through rehumanization videos. And then more precisely in process design, in peace negotiations, I talk about it in my PhD, and there are really then certain contact interventions, there are certain informality interventions, certain commonality interventions to help make it more concrete in terms of how to design an environment that allows for this process. However, it's still a psychological process that somewhat has to unfold naturally, but you can create environments or use tools that make it more likely.
That's wonderful. Charlotte, the last thing I will say is there is a question about um, uh, uh, the role of trust. And I think that, you know, we talk a lot about negotiation, about gaining, building, and keeping trust. What could you say about how that, may be applicable to your research? And we'll make that the last question. Unfortunately, we will continue our discussions. Folks have your contact information there to continue directly.
Yeah, no, I would say early on there's a lot of mistrust, paranoia. Then ideally there would eventually be trust in the process or maybe trust in the mediator. And that can then maybe be translated into transactional trust, building on you do this and I do that, so that you have somewhat a working relationship trust. Real trust, I think it's very difficult, but I do think that if you have trust in the process of the negotiation or trust in the mediators doing their best, that can be enough for progress. But trust and rehumanization are separate. So the research showed that you can see somebody as a human again and still not trust them because maybe they're just not trustworthy. But seeing them as a human is a precondition for building trust. However, I think it's important to really distinguish what kind of trusts are actually realistic and what kind of trusts will probably never occur in the context of real enemies and warfare.
Hmm. Okay, lovely. Charlotte, thank you so much. We have at
Thank
least one
you.
person in the questions who is saying that this social emotional aspect is so important in this field and so grateful that you were considering it. I know many of us here at the program feel that too. So thank you. And we will now invite Yaoxi, last but not least, to present her work over the course of this year. Yaoxi, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Can you all see my slides okay?
Yes, great, Yaoxi.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, thanks, Nicole. And thanks, everyone, for dialing in and spending time to be with us. I'm Yaoxi Shi. I'm a fifth-year Ph.D. candidate in organizational behavior at Imperial College London, and I'm also a visiting scholar at Harvard Business School and Kennedy School. And today in this talk, we are going to dive into the world of conversation. And I'm very excited to share with you about my recent work on initial conversations, how to make initial conversations better. So let's start with negotiations. So when we work into a negotiation table, we don't really start immediately exchanging offers. But before the deal terms are on the table, there's initial exchanges where we do introductions, we get to know each other, do small talks. This is a couple minutes of small talks that shapes our impressions of each other, and it could also shape how negotiation unfolds in the next stage of the negotiation. However, these small talks are not only in negotiations, they are everywhere in our everyday life in many broad contexts, like a couple of minutes in job interviews or in networkings, in conferences when we sit around the strangers and try to make friends with them, or just when we run into new colleague in our office, try to build a friendship. So we all know as these initial conversations are really important to form impressions and build relationships. But maybe as we also experienced, they are very difficult to navigate. We often struggle what we say in these conversations or even how to approach strangers, how to navigate the process of the conversation to leave good impressions. So this is such a difficult experience, as we may all know. So there are a lot of advice on the internet that teach us how to navigate small talks, how to build rapport, and how to navigate networking events effectively. However, surprisingly, there are very little empirical-based work to suggest how we could actually navigate this process effectively. So now let's just dive into these two persons for a second. So Anne is talking to Bob and try to build a friendship with him. So what Anne say in this conversation will shape how Bob will perceive Anne after the conversation and their decision to whether to talk to Anne again and build connections with her. Okay, so in these conversations, there are actually two common conversation behaviors that we do. We term self-focus, meaning that we talk about ourselves. For example, this person say, I tried salsa dancing this weekend. We can share our hobbies, experience, and opinions through this self-focused language. And another type is other folks' behavior, meaning we encourage our conversation partner to talk more about themselves, or we respond to what they say, we bring back what they say in the conversation earlier, back to the conversation to suggest to show our attention and listening to them. This is like other focused conversation behavior. And there's some recent research looking into the effect of self-focused behavior and other focused behavior. For example, when we talk a lot about ourselves in the conversation, it could seem as self-centered or narcissistic and tend to reduce liking. And conventional wisdom on this topic from almost 100 years ago proposed that individuals should talk less about ourselves. Instead, we should focus more on the conversation partner to build positive impression. And even nowadays, we can easily find this piece of advice online to build real relationships. We need to make conversation about other people instead, not to make conversation about business or us. So far, what we learned from here suggests that in these initial conversations, we should really talk less about ourselves and more on the other person. However, talking about ourselves, revealing our personal information clearly is an essential part of building relationships. So here's how relations form. We meet each other and get to know a little bit more about each other. And as this process evolves, and as our personal knowledge of each other accumulates, the relation form. So this self-disclosure behavior exactly serves this function, revealing ourselves to the other person, letting other people know us more to form relationship. So here, it's kind of like self-focused behavior, talking about ourselves. The evidence is really mixed here. So in this talk, we are really going to collect data, use data-based approach to solve this question. So when is talking about ourselves good or bad in initial dyadic conversations, which we term self-disclosure dilemma. So when we think about how to navigate self and other focus, we often think them as two opposite ends of one dimension. A person can either be self-focused or other-focused. For example, here is one conversation that we collected in our studies from a participant. This person say, I recently moved to a new townhouse. My neighbor asked me some questions about myself, including my previous living experiences in my family. And they also talked about my loan and complimented on my work. This is such a nice other folks neighbor to have. And on the other end, here's another neighbor. So my neighbor saw me outside and walked over to say hello. He wanted to tell me how he got a new car. He told me all about buying it and how he chose it. He told me the price and how much he negotiated down. This is such a good negotiator, but just seems as a little bit self-centered in the conversation. It seems like in the conversation, the person can either be high on self-focus or high on other focus. And here we would like to, in this project, we would like to shift this mindset a little bit to argue that self-focus and other focus behavior, they're actually two dimensions. People can have high on both dimensions or high on one dimension. So this other folks neighbor, this conversation lives in this quadrant, low on self-focus and high on other focus. And this good negotiator neighbor lives in this space, high on self-focus and low on other focus. And of course, in this initial conversations, we could also talk about things that other than the two people in the conversation. For example, this conversation talks about the National Football League draft, what's going on when the conversation happened. And of course, we could also be high on both other focus and self-focus. For example, this conversation. I met a new coworker in the break room at work. He told me about his experiences before joining the company and asked me what I enjoy doing in the spare time and shared the story of painting he recently made. So this sounds really a nice conversation to have, a nice coworker. So for comparing to this neighbor who is really good at negotiating, they both talk about themselves pretty much in the conversation, and there's something different about talking about self that makes the impression different. So perhaps it's just like a coworker who is good at painting. Essentially, they're more likable than a neighbor who is really a good negotiator. Maybe that's the possibility. But here we also want to argue that there is something deeper going on here, which is perceived intention. So we human as social beings, we are incredibly smart in social sensing. So we constantly make attributions of other people's behavior. So not only what the other people do, but also like, why do they do this? And in the conversation, we constantly think about why do they say certain things to us. So for example, a person talking about themselves, revealing some personal information about them, we are in the back of our mind in the conversation, we constantly thinking, okay, why are they sharing? So going back to the negotiator, the neighbor who is a really good negotiator, when they told us about this process of buying a car, we might be thinking of, are they telling us this to connect, build more connection with us, or to vent about the process, or to impress and seek validation that we also think they are a great negotiator. So we constantly thinking about these questions, why they are doing certain things, why they are saying certain things in the conversation. And often sharing about ourselves, the intention are pretty ambiguous. The other people don't really know why we are saying certain things. And we make these interpretations of why other people say certain things based on what other things that they say in the same conversation. So for self-disclosure, when they tell us about something about themselves, we make attributions based on what other people say surrounding that self-disclosure. And this perceived intention can really matter for how the effect of talking about self to be good or bad for the entire conversation. So for now, let's bring back this other folks' behavior for just a minute. We human, we also have these basic fundamental needs to be heard and understood by others. And other folks' behavior like question asking, showing listening, really signals attention, interest, and responsiveness that we are having to the other person. And here we argue that other folks' behavior like question asking, paying attention, listening, they can really shape how we perceive other people's intention of self-disclosure. So in a way that when we ask a lot of questions, our self-disclosure can be perceived as a willingness to build connection. So the motive of we sharing about ourselves are perceived as more relational rather than being self-centered and attract attention, the self-related motives. So this is the main idea. And in order to test this idea, we analyzed thousands of conversations over the year. And here we have 5 studies. And today in this talk, we are just focusing on 3 of them. So study 1, 3, and 4. So in this study 1, we went to lots of real-world networking events to just capture how people are talking to strangers in these real-world settings. So we collaborated with lots of networking events in the city of Chicago and also student programs at Imperial College London, where the program pairing students from different backgrounds to make friends with each other. We were able to collect 322 participants from 13 networking events. And in each of these networking events, we approach people in a diet, having conversations with a stranger and invite them to answer a very short survey. So in the survey, we ask them to rate how, after the conversation in the survey, we asked them to rate how much do you want to form connection with a conversation partner, how much you want to talk to the conversation partner again, and develop personal relationship, professional relationship. But after these questions, they also reported how self-focused and other folks their conversation partner were in the conversation. So for self-focused, we ask how much they talk about themselves in the conversation. And for other focus, we ask them how much they encourage you to talk about yourself or how much they talk about you in the conversation. And then they reported basic conversation information and their own demographics. So here we find, first we find there's a main effect of other focused behavior. As the more question you ask to your conversation partner, they are going to like you more because they know you are interested in them. And we also find this interaction effect of self and other focus aligning with what we were arguing before. When other focus is low, this blue line, meaning that when, for example, when I ask very few questions in the conversation, then the more I talk about myself, it's really perceived as badly, and the other people will not want to make connections with me. On the other side, when I ask more questions in the conversation, the effect of talking about myself is more positive, meaning that when I ask more questions, then when I disclose more about myself, I'm perceived as more positively, and the other people are more likely to build connection with me. So this is aligned with what we are arguing about. And this is from the real networking events. And then we also looked into the actual conversation behavior people are having in those initial conversations. So in the networking study, what we are studying is what happened in one person's mind, how this person's perception of self and other focus of the other person influence their perception of the other person. And right now we are going to look at what actually their conversation partners say in the conversation from the transcript that we were able to record from thousands of conversations, that the actual behaviors influence the partner's perception of the speaker. Okay, so we first, sorry, this is a pretty technical slide here. So first, what we did is to measure self and other folks' behavior from transcript. So we first built a training data set from a separate 7-minute get acquainted conversation transcripts to make sure the algorithms that we develop here can capture self-focused and other folks' behavior pretty accurately to be accurately predicting self and other focus behaviors in another much larger data set. So the predicting data set that we are using includes 1,600 dyadic conversations, and this is published in this paper. So all these participants are from diverse backgrounds, and they are paired up to have around half an hour get acquainted dyadic video conversations over Zoom, and they are all recorded and transcribed. And after those conversations, they rated how much they like their conversation partner from in this questionnaire. Okay, so in this transcripts, we were able to extract how much each person talk about themselves and how much each person talk about their conversation partners in the conversation. And similarly, we are able to find this interaction effect, meaning that when other focus is low, the more you talk about yourself, the lower the liking. And when other focus is high, meaning when people are asking more questions, the more you talk about yourself, the higher the liking become. And finally, we look at the perceived intention mechanism. To test this idea, we build a chatbot. Build two versions of chatbot. One asks questions in the conversation, another does not. The participants have 5 minutes conversation with the chatbot online. And after 10 exchanges, the chatbot will do a self-disclosure randomly selected from a list of self-disclosure messages. For example, here is one example, messages. By the way, I just started getting into podcasts about history and I'm kind of obsessed. I find it kind of relaxing to learn about random historical stuff. This is a self-disclosure message. The chatbot will send this message to the participant, and participant will rate their perceived intention of this message, being like why this person is sharing this message in the chat. And then they also rate their overall impression of the counseling partner. By the way, in this study, they think their partner is a human participant. At the end, we debrief with actual chatbot. Okay, so for this self-focused message, they rated these three arguments. The counseling partner wanted to share this to build connection, to get closer, to share something personal with you. And overall, after the conversation, they also rated liking, closeness, and how much they want to build connection with their counseling partner. But here again, we find that when the chatbot is asking more questions, the perceived intention of sharing is more likely to be build connections rather than being self-centered. And overall, they also liked the chatbot. They seem that asked more questions in the study. Okay, just to sum up. So here we find that other folks' behavior, like question asking, show listening, or use callbacks to what the other people say before, have positive main effect on impression and intention to connect in initial conversations. So ask more questions. And also, other focus changes how people perceive why people share about themselves. When we ask more questions, then the more we talk about ourselves to the partner, they will perceive us to be more willing to share about ourselves to connect rather than to be self-centered and attract tensions. Therefore, increases liking. So next time, perhaps when you think about how to navigate self and other focus, you can and should talk about yourselves as long as you also ask questions. Okay, so this is my research about initial conversations, and I've been doing conversation research over the past 5 years. And I also look into all these other different contexts that we talk to other people and how what we say serve as the effective signal that shapes how the other people perceive us and the important outcomes that it's leading to. Okay, so with that, I would like to thank the program on negotiation for the support over the year, and also my collaborators for this project and my mentors in Harvard Business School and Kennedy School that has been supporting me over my journey. All right, so if you are interested in conversation and want to talk more about it, please welcome to get in touch.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Yaoxi. Great. And I know that we'll have a number of questions in the chat. I will signal that we are technically almost at the time where we were going to end, but we will, of course, go a little bit over for questions for Yaoxi. A first question from Lilia about the impact of culture on self-focus or other focus, Yaoxi. Have you done any work on the variations that, I very much imagine can happen in different cultural contexts there?
Yeah, such a great question. Thank you. So culture matters a lot on how we interact with others and how we interpret on what the other people say. So all these data we collected in this study are all from the Western culture, and I'm very curious about how people in Eastern culture, myself included, would interpret differently about what other people say. I would imagine, so here's my speculation. I would imagine that talking about selves is more like tolerant in American culture, probably. And it like people value humble, people value less like people value other focus more, probably in Eastern culture. But overall, I would think this interaction effect that we are able to identify here is more generalizable because this goes into like our human needs of our basic needs that we want to be heard, be understood, and if the other people pay more attention to us, our self-disclosure is going to be perceived as more positively and more relational. I think this might be more as like a universal thing of human being, and culture could add another layer for specific effect of self and other focus. It's a great question.
And Yaoxi, is there a limit to how much other focus, can it backfire at some point? Because it sounds like a good thing, but I could imagine that that is not universally true.
Yeah, yeah. So imagine a conversation, the other person only asks you questions and they don't talk about stuff. So like the over asking could definitely be a bad thing, especially like people also interpret like why you are asking questions. So there are different questions to be asked. For example, like I can imagine follow-up questions is probably on the better side. Like when you disclose about yourself and the other people just follow-ups and they seem very interesting what you say, this could be really good. But there's other type of question that seems like to be instrumental or like more information focused, not really interesting you, but like because of your job or like because of your networks you have. So people make interpretations about the question and some type of question, and also like over asking the question could be interpreted badly.
Yeah. Yaoxi, you're going to make us all better at our next dinner party that we have to go to. So I think this is practical advice for whatever everybody's doing Friday night. Um, Precisely a question on whether or not your research has uncovered how can you ask other focused questions without seeming like you're prying or, or asking too much personal information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an important question, and this is a hard one actually. So I would suggest that there are different type of questions, and the follow-up question is a particularly good one because this is building on what the other people already say. The other people already they are willing to tell something about themselves, and then you can keep follow up and digging into this gold mine of the other people's world, and people always interpret that as you are interested in them. And there's another type of question that is really bad, which is uh, by my advisors, Mike Yeomans and Alison Wood books, they call boomer asking, meaning that when you ask a question and then the other people answer, and then suddenly you turn conversation back to yourself and you started to answer that question yourself and saying a lot about yourself. And this is kind of like people will perceive that as like you're being strategic, just using that as a chance to talk about yourself instead of showing interest in them. Yeah, so that type of question we would like to avoid.
Mm, that's great. Yoshi, we have a question. You present kind of a spectrum of self-focused and other focus. Is it that binary? Are there others? Someone is asking a question here, like if we ask about the weather, is that neither self-focused or other focused? And how does that work into conversational success, I guess?
Yeah. Um, so we often talk about weathers as I'm from London. People will be
Yes.
familiar with that topic. So self and other focus, they are not two ends of one dimension. They are not trade-offs. Like talking about weather could be low self focus and low other focus. It lives in that quadrant. And also in the conversation, it's like we are digging deeper into the relational dynamics that we are building. And we often first start with like the topics that are very easy to reach, like our surroundings, the weather, the news are happening. And then we go into deeper. And in those space, we could ask like more deeper questions and doing deeper self-disclosure. We are navigating this topic hierarchy. Yeah, so talking about whether it's totally fine in the beginning, as long as we also go deeper into the conversation, revealing about ourselves and also asking about the other person like deeper to build relationships.
Yeah, wonderful. And again, I expect that that has a cultural component as well, right? In
Yeah.
certain contexts. So absolutely lovely. Yaoxi, thank you so much for your presentation and for being with us throughout the course of this year. And we're wishing you all the best. And everyone, I know we've gone a bit over time, I think not horrifically so, but in PON with such a wide variety of scholars, both next generation and on our current faculty roster. I would like to conclude by saying that in the course of the month of May, we have two more live events coming up, including one next week, a Kalman seminar, PON Live, with Sarah Fetterman. And I'm reaching across my desk because I realized that her book on corporate reckoning was over on the other side, presenting her work. And then Tamarasi Fakori of Tufts University on May 19th. So we look forward to seeing many of you at one of our live events or perhaps in person in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's so lovely here right now. And I think most of us will be trying to get outside at some point in the next couple of days. Thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.